Antoinette Price. I'm Water Resource Planning Manager at Southern Water. Steve?
I'm Steve Morley, I'm the Regulation Manager at Portsmouth Water.
And we hope to be joined shortly by Paul Kent, who's our Wastewater Strategy Manager at Southern Water as well. But I think Steve's obviously had some difficulties with Paul's had some difficulties with the traffic tonight, but we'll make a start. We've got, I think about sort of 20 minutes to go through a presentation, and then I think there's some time afterwards for some questions that you might have. So I'm going to start off the presentation. It's a joint presentation that we've put together with Portsmouth. And can I bring up the slides myself? Is that just with the arrows? Thank you. Yes, so it's a joint presentation that Southern Water and Portsmouth Water have put together today to explain how we plan for future water supply and wastewater provision to customers. Obviously, we're going to give a little bit of a broader introduction to the subject, but then have some focus obviously on the Ferrum area as well, so given the local interest in this area. First slide for you is a map showing the Ferrum Borough area and the split, showing how on a water supply basis the Ferrum Borough is sort of split, as you can see with that black line down the middle. So the part of the borough to the west is supplied by Southern Water, and the area to the east is supplied by Portsmouth Water. And obviously wastewater is completely provided by Southern Water. Southern Water do wastewater for the whole of southern England, whereas on the water supply basis it's much more fragmented with different water companies covering different areas. So this is not unusual that your borough is split with two water companies doing the water supply. The figures at the bottom are taken from our respective demand forecasts. The growth numbers were show housing, property and population numbers in 2017, so that's obviously current year, and forecast in 2045, with percentage figures after those. These figures, the sort of forecast figures, have been done fairly recently for our updated water resource management plans, and I'll come on to that process that we follow in developing water resource management plans shortly. But that's just to give you an idea of the approximate split. So on water supply, you can see that Portsmouth Water have more customers than Southern. On wastewater, as I said, it's all provided by Southern Water. So the process. So I'm going to cover with Steve the water supply side, and then Paul will cover the wastewater side. On the water supply side, we produce water resource management plans, which look to plan ahead a minimum 25 years. We review these and update these every 5 years. It's a statutory process. It's a statutory process laid out in legislation by DEFRA. We have to submit our plans every 5 years to DEFRA, and there's a public consultation on those plans, allowing anyone to comment, and we'll take on board those comments on the plans, and we'll then update those plans based on customer and stakeholder comments. There's essentially, without going into too much detail, there's essentially 3 key components to the water resource management plan that we have to consider. There's the demand forecast, basically how much water we think we'll need to provide customers over the next 25 years or longer. There's our supply forecast, how much water we think we can reliably supply during design conditions, drought conditions. We have to think about when the system is stressed and when maybe when it hasn't rained for a long time, and how much water would be available. And then looking at that balance, there may be a gap, a deficit, and that deficit means we have to consider what options are available to manage that deficit. That might be reducing consumption through demand management measures like leakage reduction or water efficiency, or it might be looking for new supply options, reservoirs, boreholes, transfers from other water companies, which is where we'll come on to how we've been working with Portsmouth Water to share the available resources in this region. So they're the three key elements of a water resource management plan. So we are at a stage now in the process where both companies, indeed all companies across the whole country, are about to submit their updated draft water resource plans to government. So these will go out for a public consultation in the new year. So you're sort of getting a bit of an early sight of what you will see in our water resource management plans. So I want to talk about working together, how we have been working with Portsmouth Water and indeed other water companies in the southeast to ensure that we're making best use of available resources. The Portsmouth position sort of currently looking ahead is that generally speaking Portsmouth have got sufficient water under most scenarios to meet customer requirements, so they've got a reasonably positive outlook there. In the southern water, looking at our Hampshire area, because we supply in Sussex and we supply in Kent, but focusing in our Hampshire area, we have historically had a good surplus of supplies. However, one of the key drivers and challenges that we need to take account of looking to the future are how our supplies are now will be affected by some environmental drivers. This is where our extraction licences that are granted by the Environment Agency will be are proposed to be reduced to ensure that those rivers are protected, the ecology is protected. So we are currently having to plan for the possible significant reduction in what we take from the River Test and the River Itchen. And there is, just as an aside, a separate process going on that is reviewing those proposals because they are having such significant impacts on our ability to supply in the short term. And that's what I want to touch on that a little bit before I come back to how we've been working with Portsmouth Water. Just moving on to the next slide, which is quite a lot going on in that slide. On the left-hand side, we've got the graph shows how much water we've historically put into supply in our Hampshire, what we call our Hampshire Southampton East area water resource zone. So this is quite a large area. It's about 130 million litres a day we put into supply last year in this area. Up to now and currently we have good availability of supplies to meet that demand, and our customer levels of service of only needing to put hosepipe bands on in maybe one in 10 years we can meet quite easily. However, as a result of the licence changes which are proposed, our level of resilience significantly reduces, meaning customers in the short term could face much more frequent restrictions, hosepipe restrictions. So what we are doing is looking at having to look at a range of different strategies to address these licence changes, which, as I said, are proposed. They're not enforced yet. They could be enforced soon, and hence the separate process, this inquiry that is looking at the implications of those changes because they are so significant. For our water resource management plan then, we are having to look at the possibility of losing significant resource on the River Test and River Itchen, and we've looked at a whole range of options to manage that. And at that point I'll come back to the working together slide, where I wanted to emphasise the work we've been doing with Portsmouth Water before I touch on some other options we've been looking at. As I said previously, Portsmouth Water have historically and still currently have had quite a healthy supply-demand balance position. They have an abstraction as well from the River Itchen in Hampshire, so we have also abstracted the River Itchen but further up. And we are already now putting in place a scheme to transfer water from Portsmouth Water across to our into our supply area in Hampshire that will help us in the short term. We've got two further options to take additional water from Portsmouth Water, one in about 5 years' time and the other one in about 10, 11 years' time. The second one is likely to be dependent on development of Havant Thicket Reservoir, which is an option that Portsmouth Water have had in their plans for a number of years, pending the need for it, and as a result of our need now, Southern Water's need, it is now driving that scheme to be brought forward to a point at, as in we would get that option in as soon as possible to help address our supply deficits that we will face. So that is, I say, an example of how we're working quite closely at the moment with Portsmouth Water. In the wider picture, outside just the southern Portsmouth Water arrangements, we are working also with other water companies, South East Water, Bournemouth Water to the west as well, who will be able to provide us with some additional supplies. We've even looked as far as Thames Water right up on the River Thames. So this is a significant deficit we're facing, and we're looking at some very significant options to address that. So other options that we are looking at very closely at the moment are water reuse, so effectively recycling wastewater, putting that wastewater, which may currently go out into the marine environment, putting that back into the river above one of our abstraction points to take it back out of the water after it's been cleaned up to a suitable standard. Recycling that already goes on in many catchments around the country. So we're looking at water recycling, we're looking at desalination as well, which to some people seems quite an extreme measure, but we are in a challenging environment where there are very limited options now available for additional supplies. So we're looking at these range of options to make sure that we can maintain supplies, and we will be presenting 4 different strategies for Hampshire that will cover the potential outcomes of these licence changes, which I've mentioned already, which will obviously drive the need for us to develop these new options over the next 5 to 10 years. So there's going to be a lot of development needed over the next 5 to 10 years to meet that short-term challenge. So I think I've covered most of the points on that slide. We talked a bit about the level of resilience here. I'll just emphasise again, as I said, it might mean that there is a short-term need for customers to experience a reduced level of service when it comes to frequency of restrictions, hosepipe bans, which are now called temporary use bans. But we are working closely with government and the Environment Agency to make sure that we can obviously maintain supplies during drought conditions. I should emphasise again, we are talking about drought conditions. In normal conditions, it's not an issue, but when we're in drought conditions, when resources are stressed, that's the key challenge that we will have. So obviously it will depend on the weather conditions as to how much of a challenge it is. And just in terms, I've talked a bit about some of the options that we're having to consider, and we are currently assessing for incorporation into our new water resource plan. One of the options on the screen here is the Budds Farm to River Itchen indirect potable water reuse scheme. So this is a water recycling scheme taken from our Budds Farm wastewater works near Portsmouth Harbour, with a pipeline that would then, upon further treatment of that water, it would discharge that water into the River Itchen above our Otterbourne intake, which is near Winchester. We would then take the water out of our existing intake at Otterbourne, treat it again to a drinking water standard, and use that to support abstraction during low flows. So when the flows in the River Itchen do drop to a key threshold, environmental threshold, it allows us to support those flows. The reason, obviously, I wanted to show this one that you'd be interested in is because this is obviously some early design. There would be more work done to refine this option, and also this option actually isn't necessarily needed in all scenarios. We do look at a range of scenarios in terms of different projections of demand, different impacts of climate change, and these different licence changes, which I've already mentioned. So it's not definite that this option will be needed, but we do plan to cover a range of uncertainty in our water resource plan. So we use techniques that allow us to ensure that we've got a resilient strategy. So I suppose I did want to emphasise that whilst I'm emphasising some highlighting some challenges, we've got strategies that will be published as part of our plan in the new year. So we have got the ability to meet the new housing figures that we've incorporated into our demand forecasts. This particular option might have some local interest. So I think at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Steve to pick up a few more of the sort of local issues.
Do you have any questions of me initially?
There's one from me, if I may.
Yeah.
You were talking about you can cope during normal conditions. What are normal conditions when we're anticipating significant growth in households through development? So are normal conditions now or projected through growth?
Yes, sorry, yes. When I talking normal conditions, we normally relate to, we're talking about sort of normal weather conditions. So the growth that is part of the local plan proposals is factored into all our forecasts. So in normal weather conditions, that growth is dealt with without problems. It's when you have the dry weather, when the amount of resource available to supply those customers, that's the more challenging point that the Water Resource Management Plan focuses on. So in normal weather conditions, there's not a problem.
So for Portsmouth water, if you imagine we've got the aquifer sitting on the South Downs. If we had 2 dry winters, then the aquifer itself is not recharged. So that sort of subsequent summer, we would be thinking about the restrictions on customer use, which in old language is hosepipe bans. So when Nick's talking about scenarios, or it's really the levels of service that we can meet, given the weather patterns that we've experienced over 2, 3, 4 years on the bounce. And if we were at 4 years, dry winters, we'd be in a very severe drought period, and there would be significant restrictions on customers, including commercial customers. But that's the most extreme sort of thing that we plan. So our objective overall is always to plan for these quite extreme, rare events, and they may happen. The one we're looking at the moment is probably once every 200 years, is the sort of statistics. But that's the level of resilience which we're hoping to plan for in the future. And I think working together we can certainly move a long way to improving the resilience that we currently have.
Are you picking up changes in the environment? Nature's recharging. Are you picking up changes within the climate change?
I think the honest answer is it's too early to tell. I think we are definitely seeing changes in weather patterns, and that may be that we want to think about the way we collect the resource. So again, if I use the simple example, we have the aquifer. That really relies on good, steady rainfall in this particular period now. Whereas if you were collecting water by a reservoir, really, whenever it rains, you can collect that water. So if weather patterns do change, and they do seem to be changing, the way we as an industry collect the water, we may need to change that.
Are you confident that you can meet the demand that's going to be placed onto you with the development within the area?
Yeah, the answer is for Portsmouth Water, the answer is yes. I don't want to sound overconfident, because we are in a very privileged position in Portsmouth. We've got an aquifer which has probably got the most resilient, most reliable supply in the country. In particular, the springs at Havant are really, really good. Almost all the rainwater that's collected in the Downs will permeate through the chalk, and literally just before it goes out to the harbour there, we capture it. So we're in a very, very privileged position. But Portsmouth Water, yes, to meet its demand from its customers over the long term, yes, we're comfortable with that. But of course, when we've spoken about partnerships, it's what can we do to help, in particular, the southern issue in Hampshire, because they're not in quite as privileged position. And I think it's fair to say some of the environmental requirements on the two rivers that Nick's mentioned, we don't face those issues because we're not impacting them the same.
So from a southern perspective, I would say again we are confident, but the implications, as I've been mentioning, around having to ensure that we do maintain the level of resilience that we've had historically will require these new solutions. Some of them quite expensive. So there obviously will be a knock-on effect to customers in terms of customer bills, and obviously these options. The driver here is to protect those unique rivers that the tests are niche in, but the solutions that we are putting in will also have a certain amount of environmental impact as well. So it's clearly there's a balance to be had here, which is the reason for the inquiry that's going to look at the whether those licence changes are being implemented at the right time, because there could be implications of that. But we will have as I said, a range of strategies in our plan, all of which will allow the proposed growth to be met in terms of water supply.
You mentioned the licence changes several times.
Yes.
Presumably they mean an increased demand on your services or on the provision of water.
Sorry, so to be clear, the licence changes I'm talking about are changes to our abstraction licences, which are granted by the Environment Agency, and they limit the amount that we can take from the environment, so from a river or from a groundwater source. That licensing system's been in place for 50, 60 years now, and obviously does a good job at protecting the environment. And these are, and over the last 20, 30 years, we've worked with the Environment Agency to ensure our licences are sustainable. So we have made changes in the past. So this isn't a new initiative, but for these two rivers, the changes are very significant compared to what we've had to deal with in the past.
Move on.
Just like to regarding patterns, you look like last year's pattern. That seems to have altered over the last couple of years. We've seen a different pattern this year regarding rainfall. And can also ask a question about the Howland Reservoir. Are we saying now that is more or less going to come forward now?
Well, I'll deal with the second question first. So Portsmouth will be putting a proposal for Howland Thicket in its water resources plan. And that, as Nick said, that will go to DEFRA on the 1st of December, and then we'll go out to public consultation. From our point of view, the reason it's needed is to allow greater bulk supplies, greater volumes to be given to Southern in their Hampshire area. So the likelihood of us needing it for our own customers is very, very low in the medium and short term. But certainly in terms of the work that we've done as a group of companies in the southeast, Howland Thicket is definitely what they call a regional solution. It's the right thing to do in the region to then benefit, in particular, the customers of Southern New Hampshire.
And just on your point about rainfall patterns, we are continually seeing more varied and rainfall patterns different to perhaps what we've seen in the past, which is one of our challenges when we have to forecast what we could supply, what we could see available in the future. Without going into too much detail, one of the techniques we employ is something called we use a stochastic weather generator, which allows us to generate literally thousands of years worth of data based on what we've seen historically, and it effectively samples and creates synthetic weather records from what we've seen in the past. So this allows us to make sure our plans are resilient to a wider range of weather patterns to what we've seen historically.
Okay, gentlemen, do you want to
Okay. Well, my first slide was picking up on your local plan and looking at the development that your plan was talking about. I think what all that we were trying to emphasise here is clearly some of the sites are in Portsmouth area, some are in Southern's area, and we've estimated the indicative usage or the volumes that we would need to be able to provide. And I don't think in simplistic terms, those sort of volumes, we can accommodate those extra volumes. I think we've said a number of times the issue is not particularly the growth in the housing, it's on the environmental side, on the southern side. So, from a Portsmouth point of view, there's no real issues on that side, and effectively the extra water that we are planning to provide to Southern will ensure that there's sufficient water for those developments. I'm conscious that Wellbourne's a pretty big issue in this area, and we've already had some discussions with your officers on this particular issue. I think where we are at the moment, the last time we spoke to it was WSP, the agents on behalf of the developers, was as long ago as April. But I mean, the big issue for us really in providing the water to that site is not the water, but it's actually the infrastructure itself, the pipes. And I think we've pointed out to WSP that we've got some pretty big strategic mains already going through that area, which will need to be moved to allow the housing to be planned the way that currently is being planned. And they're not, for us, they're not small costs, so they won't be small costs either for developers. We're looking, we put a figure of £4 to £5 million associated with the cost of moving those strategic mains. So I think the point I wanted to emphasise here is we've got the water, we just need to work together carefully and make sure that it's recognised that there are some big strategic mains already there, and we need to work our way around those. And I think at the moment, where our preferred route is sort of planned, sort of coincides with the landscaping that you've got on the Wellbourne site. So there's a sort of, we've just got to work around those things. I'll answer any questions specifically on Wellbourne.
I'm sure we are conscious of that.
Okay, cool.
And in the development of Wellbourne, it will be taken into account, I'm sure.
Regarding that, obviously that's major work you're talking about, and what would be the timescale involved in that sort of work?
You are looking at a good year to plan it properly, and at least 1 or 2 years to do the actual work. But I think the important message really is that if we're involved early in the process, in the planning process, we can do it over the appropriate timescale. Whatever the timescale is.
But are we saying that before we can actually move Wellbourne forward,
no,
we need to do that work?
No, but we need to recognise that there are some strategic mains there which need to be planned into the process of developing the site.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that's suddenly come to light.
No.
It has been
Sorry, it isn't.
Of for some time. Any other questions?
Okay, so sort of related to Wellbourne, but just these are just some general comments which I wanted to highlight really. And I think I've already mentioned how important the aquifer is to us. So we monitor activity on the aquifer very, very carefully. Why do we do that? Because any pollution to that aquifer will quickly impact on our water supply. So we have a very strong catchment management programme where we will look very carefully at all housing developments and make sure we understand the implication, in particular, on how the wastewater is disposed of. So we're fairly firm, and we will look very carefully at planning proposals to make sure we are confident that there's no detrimental impact on the aquifer. The second point I wanted to make is I'm sitting here representing Portsmouth Water, and I'm saying, you know, we could come and provide the water. We could also provide the mains, the pipe work, at somewhere like Wellbourne. But you have options. There are other people out there that you can talk to, and I'm sure you've already spoken to those as well, who can provide the infrastructure. The likelihood is that they'll still need to buy the water from us, but the actual pipe work, there's no real reason for you having to choose us. And there are plenty of people in the market who can provide that for you. And a similar point really is that effectively what our offering is good old-fashioned what they call towns water or potable water, but there are other technologies that are available. And you may have heard of grey water reuse, where the house really the water coming out of the shower, for example, is recycled. Rainwater harvesting is something which is available to you, but when you have 2 to 3 years of drought, perhaps rainwater harvesting is not always there, available, or black water reuse. So all I wanted to highlight here is that Portsmouth Water is sitting here with a fairly standard offering, be it pipes and or water, but there are other people that would be quite interested, I'm sure, in providing water to the Wellbourne site. My final point is that we don't do all these pieces of work in isolation. I think we've already demonstrated how as an industry we work together, but we do work with organisations like Push in terms of understanding what their expectations are, and we build those into the plans. So we're very much engaged with Push in particular in this area. I think that's it from a water point of view, unless you've got any questions.
With the approaches to reuse in the grey water, what size town do you have to scale up to before a town could say, we have built into our future, say Wellbourne or North Whiteley development, some scheme that says Wellbourne does have a grey water recycling thing? Is it big enough, or would it have to be twice the size?
I think my knowledge of the costs is quite limited, actually. The only example I'm aware of is in Cambridge, and I think it's called Cambridge Northwest, which is a sort of joint project with the university, and from memory I think it's about 10,000 properties. I'll put a slight caveat on that, because the university have basically said we want it to be an exemplar site, so we're going to put the money on the table. Now, I genuinely don't know the commercial costs associated with it, but there is a very good video on that development, which would be worth, if you're interested in it, having a look at that. I'm not aware of any other live schemes in the UK.
No, I'm not either. I just to add slightly, so not an example, but we are at Southern at the moment as part of a sort of a progressive strategy, but a longer term vision, if you like. We are sort of considering across the company, really trying to. At the moment, our average per capita consumption, the average amount of water that a customer uses is about 130 litres per head per day. Across the southern area, that does vary obviously from area to area. We're currently sort of considering trying to hit 100 litres per head per day in the future. Now, obviously, to do that, there's a certain amount of education that can be done, but there's probably also going to be some perhaps wider scale implementation of options, including grey water reuse. So we are looking at that. We're going to be looking at very, very closely, I think, over the next few years to see how we can achieve that quite ambitious target. So early days. I don't want to set too many promises around that, but it's an area of interest. So we'll obviously be looking at that example that Steve mentioned there to see whether there's any other developments that we could implement that in.
Elsewhere in the world, these schemes are used. If you go to Australia, you go to South Africa. But they have had very different issues. I'm not saying we won't have those issues, but they have had very significant drought impacts. But if you get in at the start and you do the full pipe systems, I think the economics it's a lot more favourable than trying to retrofit. So I think there's a big opportunity for you in terms of work to look at that seriously.
Paul, is there anything you wish to add?
Sorry, I was just going to say it is a common theme. So as well as Wellbourne, we're talking to Otterpool in Kent, where they're talking between 8,000 and 11,000 properties about how can we be more sustainable, have grey water. Ebbsfleet Development Corporation talking to them, 15,000 properties in a theme park. Again, how could we have grey water? We don't have the answer yet, but I think we will get to the answer because all parties want to get to that point. Because not only does it mean that we're taking less water, clean water from the environment to put into supply, but it's actually the more sustainable solution.
Any other questions, please?
In terms of clout, how much persuasion could you put on our developers at Wellbourne in order to bring about this grey water system? Because it seems every day the costs of Wellbourne with the highway structure and so on escalate. So obviously they're looking for a profit at the end of the day, and anything that starts to take off the profit, I'm just wondering whether you would have any ability to sort of push the scheme better than we could from the water perspective.
I think the trick there is to get in early and start talking with the developers before they've put pen to paper in terms of the designs and everything like that. And we can also look at opportunities of offering discounts. So internally we're talking about, is there an opportunity to reduce the connection fee to the sewage system, to the distribution system, if they're going to use less water, and if they're using less water, perhaps they'll achieve, part of achieving that is by using grey water. So I think, from my experiences, start the dialogue early and work in partnership. So it's not just us and the developers, it's us, the developers and the local authority all working together.
So could I just respond to that in a slightly different way? Because in terms of clout, I don't think the water companies have clout. We have options that we could work with developers. So I think it's yourselves who have the clout. So my understanding of the process is, if we are deemed to be a water-stressed area, which indeed Southern is in Hampshire, but we aren't in Portsmouth, then there are certain things that you can do in terms of your planning requirements of the developers. So you might turn around and say, we want you to design the house system so that it doesn't use more than 100 litres per person per day. And that would possibly require some of these new technologies to be put in place. And the developer will then look at the requirements that you've required as a council, and make the decision, can I make that economic or not? Now we can put offerings on the table, but in terms of clout, unless I've got this wrong, Richard, I think it's yourselves who have the clout, not the water companies.
Perhaps my question should be directed to Richard then.
Perhaps me.
Sorry, Claire.
I just had this open because I thought maybe this would come up, because obviously we've been through an examination on the Wellbourne plan, and we have a policy, well 37, on water efficiency and supply and disposal. So when you were talking about those numbers, I thought I'd quickly look at the reference, because in the policy it says all new residential development at Wellbourne shall be designed to achieve good practice standards of water efficiency by ensuring the internal potable water consumption does not exceed 105 litres per day per person. So that's already enshrined in a policy.
But Claire, sorry, with due respect, can you
enforce that? It's a nice policy, but can you insist?
It has weight, so in essence, it's a policy that has weight, so we can use that. I think, obviously, we will seek through consultation on the planning application responses, but obviously at that stage that's what the policy says.
Let's see it go through then.
Sounds reassuring, doesn't it? I think the purpose of tonight is well served, because although this particular group doesn't directly influence the development of the Wellborn Plan or whatever, it does assist them in raising questions when elements of the Wellborn Plan come forward. And with the emerging borough plan and the information you've given us today, I think that purpose will be well served. So thank you very much. See that nature's trying to help you out today. So. It must be a good day for you.
It's good news.
It's a bad day for us. But
Not too heavy.
Any other questions before they go?
So we've got a couple more slides on the wastewater.
Sorry about that. So yeah, a quick cast over. So unlike what Steve and Nick have been talking about, the water supply is split. The whole of this area, and Hampshire for that matter, is our responsibility in terms of drainage. And quite unusually, when I was looking at it in detail, that the Fareham Borough Council geographic area is quite close to our Peel Common catchment area. It's very, very rare for that to be the case. So most of the Fareham area is served by a single works, our Peel Common works. Serves a population equivalent of about just over 250,000 people. And for us to operate those works, we have a permit, an environmental permit, a discharge permit, that is, we apply to the A4 and get given and are monitored against. And that permit really says the discharge from your treatment works shall meet this quality. And it also has a volume limit, what we call a dry weather flow limit. And when we look at our current permit level and the current flows, we've got a headroom for about 10,000 properties to be able to go to that treatment works before we hit that ceiling. Hitting that ceiling doesn't mean that that we can't accept any more properties. It means that we've got to go back to the Environment Agency and apply for a new permit. And when we apply for a new permit, in very simple terms, the Environment Agency issue a no deterioration permit. So to try and explain that, if currently we're discharging 100 units of effluent and we have a permit condition that says the concentration shall be no greater than 50 units, if we want to put twice as much in, that permit condition will halve, so it will go from 50 to 25, such that the net impact on the watercourse is no different. Probably a little bit too difficult to take in on occasion, but it's really just saying for your planned development over the next 5-10 years, there is sufficient headroom at Peel Common to take that. Quite close to here, as you go back in an easterly direction, we've got our biggest treatment works in the southeast, our Budds Farm treatment works, serves Portsmouth and the mainland, Havant and the likes, and serves close on 400,000 people, and that's got significantly more headroom there. So what we can do, because every problem has a solution, so if we did run out of capacity in this catchment, for those parts of the catchment that are nearest to the east, we could pump into the adjacent catchment. So that's probably, if we needed to, that would be our option. What we wouldn't do is try and to transfer into other catchments close by, so Wickham and Southwick, for example, they are very small comparative to the Budds Farm and Peel Common, so we wouldn't transfer to those. So we have our options there. So that's how we look to manage going forward in terms of treatment capacity. Then what about the sewage capacity? That's probably more difficult to predict because we don't know exactly where developers will connect. But when developers do approach us and ask to connect to the sewage system, we look to work with them by identifying a point of capacity, i.e. where the sewer has capacity for that discharge point. And one of the things we do rely upon is working with the local authority, that when planning permission is given, if there isn't capacity in the sewage system, we look for a condition in that planning that in essence says, Mr. Developer, you've got to work with the water company. It doesn't have to be us, as Steve said, it can be somebody else, but you've got to work with a water company to find a sustainable solution for your drainage. And for us, typically that means finding the nearest point of capacity on the sewage system. When we put that infrastructure in for that developer to connect, we look for the developer to pay for that sewage infrastructure. Because in reality, the only reason we're putting it in there is to accommodate the development. If the developer doesn't pay for it, it becomes us as customers that pay for it. So as I say, we look to the developer to pay for it because we believe that's the fairest approach. Again, as we've moved forward and sewage systems have developed, and we've moved on from the Victorian combined systems where both surface water and foul go into the same system, we now look to manage the foul separately and the surface water. And again, surface water, can we actually utilise that surface water to not only manage the environment but to create a habitat perhaps in those developments? So looking at sustainable drainage solutions, solutions that either create those environments and also act as slowing the flow down. So, you know, we talked about climate change. One of the things that impact us on the wastewater side are more and more intense summer rainfall events, where in half a day you get a month's worth of rainfall event. Those do cause us problems, and I think part of the answer is those solutions where you are capturing all of that surface water and allowing it to slow down before it gets into the sewage system. And if you don't slow it down, there is a risk it will overload the sewage system and cause flooding. And when we talk about foul flows, it's easy to believe that if we're building lots of houses, then we're generating lots of foul flows. In reality, that's not the case. A typical flow from 20 properties, averaged out over the day, is 0.1 litre per second. So actually very low flows. But what we actually do when we design a system is pick up on the peak flows. So, as you would expect, first thing in the morning, families are getting up, they're having the showers, they're filling the kettle, perhaps filling the dishwasher, the washing machine. A lot of flow a lot of water being utilised and discharged to the sewer. And so typically, that becomes our peak flow for the day. And whilst that may happen in the households, probably from 7 till 9, typically in a sewer, it evens out over the day as it goes through the sewage system. But we design it, as I say, on those peak flows. And when a developer approaches us, we work closely with them to make sure that we provide a solution that's fit for purpose, creates the capacity the developer needs, doesn't create flooding in a sewage system, or if he is discharging into a sewage system, perhaps where flooding problems already exist, he doesn't make those problems any worse. What it is not up to the developer to do is pay for us to address any current deficiencies on the sewage system. That's our problem, that's up to us to pay. So I just had those couple of slides on wastewater, and happy to take any questions on that. In terms of, spoke a lot about Wellbourne, we are involved, we're meeting Sarah Ward, I don't know if it's next week or the week after, to talk about the sewage and touch upon some of those green solutions, grey water reuse, etc. See what opportunities there are by working together.
So am I right in saying then that all the infrastructure costs going in at Wellbourne in terms of waste disposal and that's going back to your point earlier on in terms of the 48 million or pounds, that's going to have to be picked up by the developer?
45 million.
48.
425.
Yeah. All that will be picked up by the developer. Portsmouth Water wouldn't pick up any. And the other one, the other question is, so you are in advanced talks with developer Wellbourne to to resolve some of the issues regarding the waste disposal there.
So we are. So the developer has approached our developer services team, which is our front-facing part of the business that deals with developers. But for something as critical or as a flagship as Wellborn, it's important that we get close to yourselves, and hence sitting down with Sarah and understanding what we need to do and what we could achieve beyond the norm.
Just out of my own interest, I think Wellborn has been planned for surface water to go into balancing ponds. Would that just allow to drift down into an aquifer, or would you actually have some plan to draw that water off for use?
So there's a mixture. So you're quite right. Some solutions slow the flow down and allow it going then into a nearest watercourse. Others, as you say, then go into the ground. What's key for us, and certainly, and Steve picked upon it, is if you're allowing that surface water to go into the ground, we need to make sure it is rainwater only and it's not wash off from the roads and diesel spillages and all the rest of it. So it needs to be properly thought through, properly designed, that what is essentially rainfall ends up soaking into the ground, what is essentially highway drains goes into a watercourse or goes into the sewer.
I'll just add on to my previous thanks. I think the reassurance that you're saying you've solved all the problems, and I'm sure you wouldn't give us that reassurance either, but at least you're cognizant of all the problems and would have food for thought for people who are challenging or discussing the Wellborn plan and other developments, because it's not only Wellborn, of course, that we can look forward to. Thank you very much for coming tonight and enlightening us and giving us a degree of reassurance. Thank you very much.